My name is Isadora, and I am 28 years old. I live in Austin, Texas, a city that carries both the hum of opportunity and the quiet ache of loneliness. From the outside, my family might have looked ordinary. A working-class household, a small business, and a modest home that my father built with years of sweat and sacrifice. But inside, things were never balanced. My mother, Lona, always favored my younger brother, Martin, and my father, Jordan, was the only one who gave me quiet support, even though he was too afraid to stand up against her openly. Growing up, I quickly realized that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many achievements I earned, my efforts would never be celebrated the way Martin's were. If he managed the smallest thing, like waking up early or finishing a task halfway, it was treated like a great victory. But when I graduated with honors, when I wrote late into the night to complete my projects, or when I won scholarships through my own perseverance, it was met with silence or, worse, sharp criticism. My mother called my work a waste of time, accusing me of throwing away my youth on something that would never build a real future. What she didn't understand, or maybe refused to understand, was that my work meant survival. I became a content writer, building my skills word by word, sentence by sentence. While Martin gambled away money, I wrote articles for businesses, blogs, and websites. I didn't rely on anyone. I built a path for myself that allowed me to fund my education and pay for my expenses. I had no luxury of being careless, unlike Martin, who knew that my mother would always cover for his failures. My father, Jordan, wasn't blind to this imbalance. Sometimes I caught him watching me as I typed at the small desk in my room, his eyes soft with pride. He never said much, but when he passed by, he would gently place a hand on my shoulder and whisper, "Keep going, Isadora. You're stronger than you think." Those moments were small but powerful, enough to keep me moving when everything else felt against me. This is the story of how I was overlooked, cast aside, and betrayed by the very people who should have stood by me. But it's also the story of how I refused to give in, how I fought back, and how I found love, loss, and ultimately the courage to stand tall again. Life inside our home was like walking through a constant storm where the thunder never stopped rumbling. My mother, Lona, had made Martin the sun around which everything revolved. Every little achievement of his, no matter how shallow or fleeting, was praised as if he had conquered the world. If Martin woke up on time, she applauded him. If he mentioned an idea, even one he would never act on, she treated him like a visionary. I remember nights when he would come home late, the smell of alcohol and recklessness clinging to him, and she would scold him only lightly before handing him food, as if he were still a child who needed coddling. Meanwhile, I felt invisible in my own house. I would spend nights pouring my soul into my writing, crafting content for clients across the country. When the payments came through, small but steady, I felt a surge of pride knowing I had earned something on my own. But whenever my mother noticed me at my laptop, she would scoff. "You're wasting your life, Isadora," she would say. "Typing words for strangers won't buy you a future. It's all nonsense." Those words cut deeper than she realized. Writing wasn't just a job for me. It was proof that I could survive without anyone's charity, that I could build something for myself. My father, Jordan, stayed quiet most of the time, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He loved me, and I knew he admired my determination. Yet, he was trapped in his own silence, afraid to confront my mother's sharp tongue. Sometimes, late at night, he would slip into my room and ask softly, "Are you managing okay, sweetheart?" His words were few, but they were lifelines. I clung to them when my mother's cruelty threatened to drown me. The tension only grew worse as Martin sank deeper into gambling. He would disappear for hours, sometimes days, and come back with excuses and empty pockets. Instead of holding him accountable, Lona would defend him fiercely. "He's just stressed," she'd say. "One day, he'll make us proud." But I knew better. I could see the destruction gathering around him like storm clouds. Still, my protests fell on deaf ears. If I tried to speak up, my mother would turn on me, accusing me of jealousy. In those moments, I learned the true meaning of isolation. To sit in a family gathering and realize that no one truly saw you, that your worth was constantly questioned, while someone else was handed everything on a silver platter. That was my reality. Yet I refused to let it define me. Each harsh word from my mother, each careless mistake of my brothers, became fuel for me to keep writing, to keep pushing forward. I knew deep down that my strength would have to come from within, because if I relied on them, I would never rise above the shadows they cast over me. What I didn't know then was that life was preparing me for battles far bigger than the ones within those four walls. The day my father died is etched into my memory like a scar that never heals. It was an ordinary morning in Austin, the kind where the sun rises slow and golden, promising calm. My father, Jordan, had been moving slower than usual, rubbing at his chest when he thought no one noticed. I did notice, but before I could ask him to see a doctor, everything fell apart. One moment he was sitting at the table sipping coffee, and the next he was on the floor. His face drained of color, his breath stolen by a sudden, merciless heart attack. I screamed for help, but by the time the ambulance came, it was too late. Just like that, the only person who ever quietly supported me was gone. The grief hit me like a wave, but I didn't even have the chance to properly mourn him. My mother, Lona, seized control almost immediately, her eyes sharp and cold even as people came to pay their respects. I overheard her telling relatives that she and Martin would now be managing the business. It was as if my father's death was nothing more than an opening for her to tighten her grip on everything he had built. Days after the funeral, the betrayal became official. I found out that she had transferred the entire family business into Martin's name. The small factory my father had spent years running, the one that had provided for us through thick and thin, was handed over to a son who had never lifted a finger responsibly. My protests were silenced before they could even form. "You don't understand, Isadora," my mother snapped when I confronted her. "A business isn't for a girl who wastes her time on a computer. Martin is the future of this family." It wasn't just the business. The house, too, the home I had grown up in, was now declared Martin's. My father had always said everything would belong to both of us, but my mother twisted his absence into her own decree. When I argued, her face hardened with fury. "If you don't like it, leave," she spat. That night, she proved she meant it. With Martin at her side, she stormed into my room. They tossed my belongings into a suitcase, their hands rough and unrelenting. Martin smirked as if throwing me out gave him power, while my mother shouted that I was a disgrace, that I would never amount to anything. Before I could gather myself, they shoved me out the front door. The slam behind me echoed like the end of everything I had ever known. Standing on the porch with nothing but a suitcase and my pounding heart, I realized how truly alone I was. My father was gone, my mother had turned against me, and my brother had taken everything. Betrayed by the people I had once called family, I had no home to return to. But as I held that suitcase tighter, I knew one thing with painful clarity. They had pushed me out, but they hadn't broken me. Not yet. When the door closed behind me that night, I stood trembling on the porch, clutching the suitcase that held the fragments of my life. The air felt colder than usual, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had truly lost everything. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and with shaking hands, I answered. It was Miranda, my closest friend from college. She had always been the one person who believed in me, even when I doubted myself. My voice cracked as I told her what had happened. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Stay where you are," she said firmly. "I'm coming to get you." Within half an hour, headlights cut across the dark street, and Miranda stepped out of her car. She wrapped me in a hug, so tight it felt like she was holding me together when I was falling apart. She didn't ask many questions, just loaded my suitcase into her trunk and drove me away from the house that no longer felt like mine. That night, I slept in her guest room, staring at the ceiling, still stunned by how quickly my life had collapsed. The days that followed were filled with quiet kindness. Miranda insisted that her home was mine too, at least until I figured things out. She gave me space to grieve, but also pushed me to keep going. "You've always been stronger than you think," she reminded me. With her encouragement, I continued my work as a content writer, setting up my laptop at her kitchen table, pushing through assignments even when my heart felt heavy. Every few days, Miranda would suggest we take a break and head to a cafe she loved. At first, I resisted. I felt too drained, too ashamed of being thrown out by my own family. But eventually I agreed. Sitting in that cafe, surrounded by the smell of fresh coffee and the hum of conversation, I felt a small piece of normalcy return. Writing during the day and sharing quiet cups of coffee with Miranda at night gave me stability I hadn't realized I was desperate for. I didn't know it then, but those small trips to the cafe were about to change the course of my life forever. The cafe that Miranda loved soon became a quiet refuge for me. Its warm lights, the soft music drifting through the air, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee made it feel like a safe corner of the world where my troubles couldn't quite reach me. I sat with my laptop there sometimes, finishing writing assignments while Miranda sipped her latte and teased me about working too hard. What I didn't realize at first was that someone else had begun to notice me. The owner of the cafe, Patrick. Patrick was different from anyone I had known. He wasn't loud or showy. Instead, he carried a calm strength that drew people in. I caught him watching me a few times, not in a way that felt intrusive, but with a kind of curiosity, as if he was trying to understand the story behind the tired eyes of the woman typing furiously at her laptop. One evening, he finally approached our table. "You come here often," he said with a small smile, his voice steady but gentle. "I hope my coffee's good enough to keep you coming back." Miranda laughed, nudging me, but I only blushed and nodded. That simple conversation turned into many more. Patrick started joining us during quieter evenings, and soon, it was just the two of us talking long after Miranda had gone home. He asked about my writing, about my dreams, and for the first time in a long while I felt seen, not as a disappointment, not as a burden, but as someone with value. Our connection grew naturally, like roots intertwining beneath the soil. He admired my determination to keep going despite what I had endured, and I admired his steady resilience in running the cafe on his own after losing his parents years before. Eventually, friendship deepened into something more. Patrick began walking me home after late nights at the cafe, and soon, he asked me to be more than just a friend. The proposal wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. Under the soft glow of cafe lights, he told me he wanted to share his life with me, and for once, my answer came without hesitation. "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling but certain. We married quietly, with only a few close friends gathered, Miranda by my side as my witness. There were no grand speeches or lavish celebrations, just two people choosing each other in the simplest, purest way. Moving into Patrick's home felt like the beginning of a life I had never thought I could have. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to truly live. Life with Patrick felt like stepping into sunlight after years of shadows. The cafe became not just his workplace, but our shared dream, and his home quickly turned into mine as well. I continued my content writing during the day, while Patrick ran the cafe, and in the evenings, we often sat together over simple dinners, talking about plans for the future. For the first time, I felt safe. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a tomorrow filled with love instead of fear. It was during one of those quiet evenings that I discovered I was pregnant. I can still remember the trembling in my hands as I held the test, my heart racing with both excitement and fear. When I told Patrick, his face lit up in a way I will never forget. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "We're going to be parents, Isadora. Our child will grow up surrounded by love." Tears stung my eyes as I realized how different this felt compared to the home I had grown up in. The months that followed were filled with gentle hope. Patrick was protective in ways that melted my heart, making sure I didn't overwork, bringing me my favorite foods, insisting on attending every doctor's appointment with me. He would rest his hand on my belly, smiling when he felt the faintest flutter, already calling himself Dad with pride. For me, every little milestone in the pregnancy felt like a promise, proof that I was building something beautiful, something no one could take away. Meanwhile, far away from our happiness, I heard whispers of how Martin's gambling had spiraled further out of control. He was selling off pieces of the family business to pay his debts, sinking deeper into ruin. My mother, Lona, defended him even then, refusing to see the destruction he was causing. I tried to push their existence out of my mind, focusing only on the life I was creating inside me, but a part of me knew that sooner or later, their chaos might come crashing back. Still, in that moment, hope outweighed fear. Patrick and I prepared the nursery together, painting the walls a soft shade of yellow. I folded tiny baby cloves with trembling hands, marveling at how small they were. We laughed, we dreamed, and we planned, building a future where our child would never feel the neglect or cruelty I once knew. For once, life felt like a story finally turning in my favor. I was 7 months pregnant when the world I had carefully rebuilt came crashing down. It was a bright afternoon, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, yet everything shifted in an instant. Patrick had been standing outside the cafe, waving goodbye to a regular customer. I was inside, sipping tea at a corner table, when the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. My heart leapt into my throat as I looked up and saw a car swerving too fast, too close. In a flash, it struck Patrick before I could even process what was happening. The force threw him to the ground, and time seemed to stop. I remember screaming his name, rushing outside as the car sped away, disappearing into the distance. My legs felt heavy, my breaths ragged, but I forced myself to his side. His eyes fluttered open briefly, his lips trying to form words, but nothing came out. I clutched his hand, begging him to stay, to fight, but within minutes the sirens arrived and the paramedics were pulling me back. I watched in horror as they tried to revive him, their voices clipped and urgent, but I already knew. Deep down, I felt the moment he slipped away from me. The funeral days later felt surreal. I stood there, my belly round with the life we had created together, while Patrick was lowered into the ground. The man who had given me hope, who had loved me when I thought I was unworthy, was gone. My hands rested on my stomach as if to remind myself I still had a piece of him with me, but it was impossible to ignore the crushing grief pressing down on me. Miranda never left my side. She was the one who helped me with the endless stream of paperwork, the hospital visits, and the nights when I broke down, sobbing into my pillow. She reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my child would carry Patrick's spirit forward. But no matter how many comforting words she offered, the loneliness was unbearable. My mother and brother never came to the funeral. Not a single phone call, not a single gesture of condolence. At first, I was relieved not to see their faces, not to feel their judgment on the one day I needed peace. Yet their absence was another reminder of how little I meant to them. Even in my darkest hour, they chose to ignore me. As the weeks passed, I felt trapped between grief and responsibility. Every kick of the baby inside me was a bittersweet reminder of Patrick's absence and the promise I had to keep. I whispered to my unborn child that we would survive, that I would protect them no matter what it cost me. I didn't know then that my strength would be tested far sooner than I imagined, and that my mother and brother's silence would not last forever. In the weeks after Patrick's death, silence became both my shield and my torment. The cafe stood open under the care of Patrick's loyal staff, while I spent most days at home, writing when I could, resting when I couldn't. My grief was raw, but I clung to the child growing inside me, whispering promises that I would somehow hold everything together. Miranda was my lifeline, coming by every day, making sure I ate, making sure I didn't drown under the weight of sorrow. It was Miranda, with her well-meaning heart, who eventually told my family what had happened. She believed that maybe, just maybe, my mother and brother would show some compassion. She thought they might realize how vulnerable I was and offer the kind of support any family should. But she didn't know them the way I did. I wasn't surprised when neither my mother nor Martin came to Patrick's funeral. Their absence cut, but it didn't shock me. What did shock me was what came after. A little over a month later, I heard the knock at the door. When I opened it, there they were, my mother and brother, standing on the porch of Patrick's home as if they belonged there. Martin looked restless, his eyes darting like a man weighed down by debts he couldn't repay. My mother, on the other hand, wore a sharp expression that I recognized all too well. She wasted no time. "You can't manage this cafe or this house on your own," she declared. "It's time you handed everything over to your brother. He'll take care of it." The audacity left me speechless for a moment. They hadn't cared when I was thrown out of my father's house. They hadn't cared when I built a life from nothing. They hadn't cared when Patrick died. And now, they dare to show up at my door, not out of concern, but out of greed. I steadied myself, placing a protective hand on my swollen belly. My voice shook, but it was firm. "When I needed you, you abandoned me. Now you come here because you want something?"
No.
"This cafe, this house, and everything Patrick built will never be yours. Not now, not ever." I saw the flash of rage in my mother's eyes, the tightening of Martin's jaw. I knew I had just lit a fire that would not end peacefully. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere inside the house shifted. My mother's face darkened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and Martin's fists clenched at his sides. I could feel the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. My heart pounded, but I didn't back down. For the first time, I had told them clearly that they had no power over me, and that truth made them furious. "You ungrateful girl," my mother hissed, stepping closer. "Everything you have now exists because of us. Do you think this house, this cafe, this life would even be possible without your father's sacrifices? You're nothing without this family, and you dare to deny your brother what he deserves." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let them show. I had been belittled for too long to let her poison define me again. I stood my ground, one hand resting on my swollen stomach, the other gripping the edge of the table beside me for balance. Patrick worked for this cafe. Patrick gave me this home.
Not you.
Not Martin. And nothing you say will ever change that. That was when my mother snapped. Her eyes darted toward the open door leading to the yard. In a sudden burst of rage, she stormed outside and returned with a thick wooden stick, the kind people often left in the lawn for support or to secure plants. My breath caught as I realized what she intended. Before I could react, she swung the stick and struck me hard across the side of my head. Pain exploded, hot and sharp, blurring my vision. I staggered, clutching at the table for support, my ears ringing. Blood trickled warm against my temple. My knees wobbled, but I refused to fall. Through the haze, I saw Martin step forward, his face twisted with anger. "You should have just listened," he muttered before shoving me with brutal force. The shove sent me crashing forward, my belly colliding with the sharp edge of the dining table. A scream tore from my throat as agony ripped through me. Then came the sudden gush, the unmistakable breaking of water. I doubled over, clutching my stomach, my cries echoing through the house. For a moment, everything froze. My mother's face flickered with panic, and Martin's eyes widened with fear. They hadn't expected this. Without a word, they turned and bolted, their footsteps pounding out the door as if running could erase what they had done. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping, tears streaming down my face. Every muscle in my body trembled as I cried out for help. My voice cracked, desperate, terrified. Not for myself, but for the child inside me. My vision blurred again, but then I heard it, pounding on the door, hurried voices calling my name. It was Kevin and Amanda, our neighbors. They burst inside, their faces pale as they took in the scene, the blood at my temple, the soaked floor, my twisted body writhing in pain. "Oh my God, call 911. Amanda shouted, rushing to my side while Kevin pulled out his phone. The next few minutes blurred into chaos. I remember Amanda holding my hand, her voice trembling but steady as she whispered that I would be okay. Kevin's urgent voice carried through the room as he gave the dispatcher our address. My body felt like it was being torn apart, each contraction sharp and merciless. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with every second. By the time the paramedics rushed through the door, I was half-conscious, my face wet with tears. They moved quickly, securing me onto a stretcher, checking my vitals, and preparing to transport me. I tried to ask about my baby, my words slurred and weak, but one of them squeezed my hand and said, "We'll do everything we can. Stay with us." As they wheeled me out into the flashing lights of the ambulance, the reality sank in. My mother and brother had left me broken and bleeding, and yet I wasn't finished. I wasn't going to let this be the end. Even in my pain, I held on to one thought with all the strength I had left. They would pay for what they had done, and I would protect my child no matter what it took. The ambulance ride felt like a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and voices I could barely comprehend. My body was in shock, trembling uncontrollably as waves of pain tore through me. Amanda's hand was still clutching mine, her face hovering above me, whispering words of comfort as if she could anchor me to consciousness. When we reached the hospital, everything moved fast. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, their commands sharp and urgent. I was rushed into a delivery room, monitors beeping, bright lights glaring down at me. Through the haze, I heard one of the doctors say, "We need to deliver now." My heart pounded as I realized my son was coming earlier than expected. Fear clawed at my chest, but then I remembered Patrick's words, the way he had promised that our child would grow up surrounded by love. I gritted my teeth, clung to that memory, and pushed through the terror. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination. Every contraction felt like fire ripping through me, but I didn't let go. I fought, not just for myself, but for the tiny life that had already endured so much. Then, finally, the room was filled with the sharp, miraculous cry of my baby boy. Tears poured down my face as they placed him in my arms. He was small, fragile, but alive. I whispered his name through sobs, holding him close, promising him silently that I would never let anyone hurt him. I spent the next few days in the hospital, recovering slowly. My head throbbed where my mother's stick had struck me, and my body ached from the sudden delivery, but every time I looked at my son's face, I felt strength surge back into me. The doctors assured me he was healthy despite the early arrival, and I clung to that reassurance like a lifeline. The police visited me during my stay. Officer Johnson spoke firmly but kindly, telling me that my mother and brother had already fled, but that warrants were out for their arrest. He promised me justice, and for the first time in years, I believed someone was truly on my side. As I prepared to leave the hospital with my newborn in my arms, I knew one truth with absolute certainty. I had survived the worst night of my life, and I had something worth fighting for. My resolve hardened. They had tried to destroy me, but all they had done was awaken a strength they could never break. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, my body was weak, but my determination had never been stronger. Holding my newborn son close as Miranda drove us home, I knew that my battle was no longer just about me. It was about protecting him, about ensuring he would never grow up in fear of the very people who should love him. The house felt different when I stepped inside again, heavier with memories of the night my mother and brother had attacked me, but I also felt a fire burning inside. They had left me bleeding and broken, and now it was time for justice. With Miranda's help, I contacted attorney Mark Wilson, a man known in Austin for his relentless pursuit of justice. Sitting in his office, still sore from my injuries, I recounted everything, from the night they had thrown me out of my father's house to the attack that nearly cost me and my child our lives. Mark listened carefully, his expression hardening with every detail. "They won't get away with this," he promised. "We'll take them to court, and we'll make sure they face the consequences." Because I had just given birth, I couldn't appear in court in person. Instead, I testified through video link from Patrick's home, my baby sleeping nearby, as I stared into the cold eye of the camera. It wasn't easy to relive the horror, but I spoke every word clearly, my voice steady even when my heart shook. I told the judge, Judge Collins, how my mother had struck me, how my brother had shoved me, how they had stolen not just property but years of peace from my life. The evidence was undeniable. The police had photographs of my injuries, medical reports from the hospital, and testimony from Kevin and Amanda, who had witnessed the aftermath and called for help. Even Miranda testified about my years of mistreatment, her voice shaking as she described how my family had abandoned me time and again. In the courtroom, Lona and Martin sat side by side, defiant at first. But as the evidence piled up, their arrogance faltered. Martin tried to blame his gambling addiction, while Lona attempted to paint herself as a misunderstood mother, but the truth was too strong to twist. When Judge Collins delivered the verdict, I felt years of weight lift from my chest. Lona and Martin were sentenced to prison for their crimes: assault, attempted coercion, and unlawful transfer of inheritance. The judge also issued a permanent protection order, forbidding them from ever coming near me or my son again. Finally, the court restored what should have been mine all along. My father's house was legally transferred back into my name, along with full protection of Patrick's cafe and property. Tears streamed down my face as I listened to the ruling. I hadn't just won for myself. I had won for my son, for Patrick's memory, and for every silent moment when I had once believed I wasn't strong enough. The truth was clear now. I had always been stronger than they wanted me to believe. When the trial ended and the final ruling was delivered, I felt as if I could finally breathe again. For so long, I had lived under the shadow of betrayal, neglect, and violence, but now the law had spoken, and justice had been served. My mother and brother were no longer looming threats in my life. They were locked away, held accountable for what they had done. The permanent protection order meant I could raise my son without fear of them returning to tear apart what little peace I had left. Settling back into Patrick's home was bittersweet. Every corner carried his presence: the books he loved, the coffee mugs he collected, the photographs of moments we had shared. At first, the memory stung, a reminder of everything I had lost. But as days turned into weeks, I began to see those reminders not as sources of pain, but as pieces of his legacy. He wasn't gone entirely. He lived on through the cafe, through the love he had given me, and most of all, through our son. I decided to set aside my work as a content writer, not because I didn't value it, but because I knew my energy needed to be poured into something bigger. Running Patrick's Cafe became my mission. I wanted to honor him by keeping his dream alive, turning it into a thriving place where people could gather, laugh, and find comfort the way I once had. With Miranda's encouragement and the loyal staff's support, I stepped into a role I never imagined for myself. Day by day, I learned how to manage the business, how to connect with customers, how to carry forward Patrick's vision. At night, when I rocked my baby to sleep, I whispered promises into the quiet, that he would grow up in a home filled with love, not cruelty, that he would know his father through the stories I would tell, that he would never feel the sting of being unwanted the way I had. Life wasn't easy, and grief didn't vanish overnight. But with every cup of coffee poured at the cafe and every smile for my son, I felt myself moving forward. This was not the ending my mother or brother had planned for me. It was my beginning, my chance to build a future on my own terms. And for the first time, I truly believed that the best chapters of my life were still ahead. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for upcoming stories. Your support means a lot and helps us continue sharing these journeys with you.